Guthrie's desperate plea coming 3.5 hours before the second deadline, which was given as 7 Eastern tonight, obviously just a couple of minutes ago. Now, that's according to the original alleged ransom note, a note which demanded $6 million by 5 p.m. local time. That's 7 o'clock Eastern, according to our affiliate, KGUN. But according to TMZ, the Bitcoin account referenced.
For a few hours on a Thursday afternoon, people following the Nancy Guthrie case believed they might finally be watching the moment everything changed. A live streamer searching a desert wash near Craycroft Road and River Road in Tucson suddenly stopped after spotting what appeared to be human remains in the dirt. His camera stayed live. Police were called. Yellow tape went up. The medical examiner arrived. Anthropology experts from the University of Arizona were brought to the scene. And almost immediately, one question spread across social media and true crime communities. Was this Nancy? But by the end of the day, authorities made their determination. The remains were human, but they were not connected to Nancy Guthrie's disappearance. Investigators reportedly identified the bone as prehistoric, likely decades old or older based on the condition of the remains and the region's archaeological history. At first, it sounded like another dead end. But the discovery may have revealed something more important than the bone itself. Because the real story was not what was found in the desert. It was how fast the system responded. Within hours, Tucson Police had secured the area. Anthropology experts were already examining the remains. Public statements were released before speculation could completely take over online. And whether people agree with every part of this investigation or not, that kind of coordinated response sends a message. This case is still active. Over the past several weeks, some people have started wondering whether the investigation had slowed down behind closed doors. Public updates became less frequent. Press conferences became quieter. Online frustration grew louder. But major investigations often become less visible precisely when the work becomes more technical. The public sees silence. Investigators see lab testing, digital evidence review, surveillance analysis, and timeline reconstruction. And according to public reporting, the Nancy Guthrie case appears to have entered that stage weeks ago. The live streamer who discovered the remains reportedly followed the correct process. He did not disturb the scene. He contacted law enforcement. He stepped back and allowed investigators to take over. In a case surrounded by live streamers, online speculation, and community searching, that difference matters. Because public attention can help an investigation, but uncontrolled certainty can damage one. And that brings us to the question investigators still seem focused on more than 100 days later. Not the bone in the desert, not the rumors online, but what happened inside a quiet 41-minute window the night Nancy Guthrie disappeared. At first, the timeline in the Nancy Guthrie case looked confusing. Then investigators narrowed their attention to a very specific stretch of time. 41 minutes, according to publicly discussed details. Nancy Guthrie returned home on the night of January 31st, 2026 after dinner with family. She entered the house. The garage door closed. For a short time, everything appeared normal. Then, at approximately 1:47 a.m., her Google Nest doorbell camera reportedly disconnected. Not because of a neighborhood outage, not because the entire property lost power, but because the device itself was interrupted. That detail changed the direction of the case. Because disconnecting a camera is not the same thing as avoiding one. It suggests awareness, possibly planning, and according to reporting tied to the investigation, the person seen near Nancy's property may already have known the camera was there before approaching the house. Then came the second major timestamp. Around 2:28 a.m., Nancy Guthrie's pacemaker connection to her monitoring app reportedly went offline. Not the pacemaker itself, the digital connection. And suddenly, investigators were left studying a timeline built around absence, a camera disconnecting, missing footage, a monitoring signal going dark, 41 minutes between those events. That window has become one of the most closely watched parts of the investigation because it may represent the period investigators believe something critical happened inside or around the home. And the more details that surface publicly, the harder it became to view the situation as random. Reports connected to the investigation described a person near the property wearing gloves, a mask, long sleeves, and carrying a backpack later publicly identified by investigators as a black Ozark Trail hiker pack sold through Walmart. The individual also reportedly attempted to interfere with the camera itself. That detail may matter more than anything else, because investigators are not only asking what happened to Nancy Guthrie, they are asking what kind of person plans for a camera before entering a property. And that question may be why this case still feels far from over. The person who approached Nancy Guthrie's home may have believed the evidence was gone forever. That assumption could become one of the biggest mistakes in the entire case. According to publicly discussed reporting, investigators were still able to recover surveillance images connected to Nancy's Nest camera, even after the device had reportedly been disconnected. Federal investigators later released images showing a masked individual near the property during the early stages of the investigation. And those images changed everything, because they suggested the person outside Nancy's home was not acting impulsively. The individual appeared covered from head to toe. Gloves, mask, long sleeves, minimal exposed skin. Reports also described repeated visits near the property across different dates, raising questions about possible surveillance before Nancy disappeared. Not random movement. Preparation. And perhaps the most important detail was psychological, not technical. The person reportedly focused on the camera before anything else. That suggests awareness of risk, awareness of evidence, awareness that visibility mattered. But according to reporting tied to the case, investigators may still have recovered residual data connected to the system through back-end storage or cached material. In other words, the camera may have stopped recording normally, but not everything disappeared immediately. That possibility transformed the camera from a failed security device into one of the most important pieces of evidence in the case. Because even limited images can create timeline. They can establish movement, clothing, behavior, direction. And sometimes behavior matters more than identity in the early stages of an investigation. Former investigators and behavioral analysts discussing the case publicly have repeatedly focused on one idea: planning. Not just because of the clothing, not just because of the gloves, but because of the sequence itself. Approach the property, disable visibility, move during a narrow overnight window, leave before daylight. That sequence does not automatically answer who committed the crime. But investigators often look at patterns before they look at names. And the pattern here appears deliberate, which may explain why federal resources reportedly remained involved even after the public updates slowed down. Because cases built around digital evidence rarely move quickly in public. But behind the scenes, they can continue developing for months, even after months of coverage. Investigators still appear focused on physical evidence that may outlast memory itself, because people forget details. Objects usually do not, according to public reporting connected to the case. One of the most discussed pieces of evidence is a hair sample reportedly recovered from Nancy Guthrie's home. The sample was later transferred for advanced forensic analysis, including FBI review and reported genetic genealogy work tied to the investigation. That matters because modern forensic cases are increasingly solved through extremely small traces. A single strand, a partial profile, a connection no one initially recognized. And investigators reportedly are not relying on just one category of evidence. The backpack publicly identified in connection with the case drew attention because it was described as a commercially available Ozark Trail hiking pack sold through Walmart on its own. That may sound ordinary, but ordinary objects create purchase histories, store surveillance, patterns of movement, possible timelines. Investigators also reportedly examined information connected to firearms equipment and a holster publicly referenced during the investigation. Details about the holster itself have remained limited, but investigators suggested it carried identifying characteristics potentially useful for tracing origin or ownership. Then there is the vehicle. According to reporting tied to the investigation, surveillance footage captured a vehicle approximately 2.5 miles from Nancy Guthrie's home during the early morning hours connected to the timeline. Investigators publicly acknowledged reviewing that footage as part of the broader case analysis. None of these details independently solve the mystery, But investigations are rarely built on one dramatic breakthrough. More often, they are built through accumulation, a timeline, a purchase, a digital trace, a vehicle, a biological sample, one detail confirming another. And that may be why authorities have continued treating this as an active investigation, despite public frustration over the pace of updates. Because physical evidence does not experience pressure the way people do. It waits. And sometimes the smallest object becomes the detail that eventually connects everything else together. The Nancy Guthrie case has also created something unusual around the investigation itself. A second story running parallel to the official one. Live streamers, independent searchers, online communities walking desert trails with cameras and flashlights, hoping to find the clue investigators may have missed. In some cases, that attention has helped keep the case visible long after many disappearances fade from public discussion. The longer a case stays active in public memory, the more likely tips continue coming in. Families often depend on that attention to prevent silence from settling around an investigation. But attention also creates risk, because the line between searching for answers and creating speculation can disappear very quickly online. That is why the desert bone discovery mattered for another reason. It became an example of what responsible public involvement is supposed to look like. The live streamer who reportedly found the remains did not disturb the scene. He contacted authorities. He stepped back and allowed investigators to take control. The moment stayed documented publicly without turning into interference. That distinction matters, especially in a case where rumors have often moved faster than verified fact. Over the past several months, online discussions surrounding Nancy Guthrie's disappearance have included theories, accusations, behavioral analysis, and speculation about people connected to the timeline. Some viewers believe public pressure helps investigations move faster. Others worry that repeated speculation can damage innocent people and distract from actual evidence. Both concerns are real, because public attention can help keep a case alive. But public certainty without proof can push an investigation in the wrong direction, and investigators appear aware of that balance. Throughout the case, law enforcement has repeatedly held back specific details that have never been released publicly. Former investigators often explain that decision the same way. Certain facts remain private, so investigators can later determine whether a suspect possesses knowledge only the offender would know. In other words, silence is not always inactivity. Sometimes silence protects the case itself. And after more than 100 days, that may be one of the hardest realities for the public to accept. Not every answer arrives immediately. Not every clue becomes public. And not every important development happens in front of a camera. For many people following this case, the hardest question is no longer what happened inside Nancy Guthrie's home. It is whether somebody outside that home already suspects the truth. Former investigators and behavioral experts discussing the case publicly have repeatedly suggested the same possibility. If the disappearance involved planning, preparation, and controlled behavior, then the person responsible may also have changed afterward. Not dramatically, not in a movie-style breakdown, but in smaller ways people close to them could notice. Routine changes, withdrawal, irritability, sudden interest in news coverage, obsessive monitoring of public discussion, or the opposite, complete avoidance of the subject. Behavioral analysis is not proof of guilt, and investigators themselves have never publicly identified a suspect in the case. That distinction matters. But experts often look at post-event behavior because major crimes can place enormous psychological pressure on the people involved, especially when a case remains active for months. And this investigation has remained active. According to publicly discussed reporting, federal and local authorities have continued reviewing digital evidence, physical evidence, and timeline reconstruction tied to the disappearance. Public statements from investigators have consistently suggested they believe the case remains solvable. That may be why reward offers and tip lines have stayed heavily promoted, because someone may already know something important without realizing how important it actually is. A conversation that suddenly felt strange. A purchase that no longer makes sense. A person who changed after February 1st. A detail ignored at the time because it seemed too small. Investigators often say major cases are not solved by dramatic confessions alone. Sometimes they are solved because one person finally connects a memory to a timeline, and timelines matter deeply in the Nancy Guthrie case, especially because so much of the investigation appears built around movement during a narrow overnight window. Who was awake? Who was driving? Who was near the area? Who suddenly became difficult to reach afterward? Those questions may sound ordinary, but investigations are often built through ordinary details examined repeatedly until a pattern finally appears. And after more than 100 days, investigators may still believe that pattern exists somewhere inside the evidence already collected. At the center of all the evidence, timelines, and public discussion is a reality that can easily disappear behind the investigation itself. Nancy Guthrie is not just a case file. She is a person whose absence changed an entire routine around her. According to public reporting, Nancy was 84 years old when she disappeared. She reportedly relied on medication and had limited mobility. Friends and family described routines people noticed immediately when they stopped happening. One report mentioned concern growing quickly after she failed to appear for a regular virtual church service. That detail matters because it reminds people how sudden this disappearance felt to those closest to her. Not gradual, not expected. A complete interruption. And after more than 100 days, that interruption still has not been resolved. That is part of why the case continues attracting attention far beyond Arizona. The story contains mystery, digital evidence, surveillance footage, and forensic questions. But underneath all of that is something simpler and harder to ignore. An elderly woman vanished from her own home. And despite the amount of attention surrounding the case, investigators have still not publicly explained exactly what happened inside that 41-minute window. That uncertainty leaves space for frustration, for theories, for fear. But it also leaves space for patience investigators may believe the case still requires. Because many modern investigations are no longer solved through immediate eyewitness testimony alone. They are solved through slow forensic reconstruction, digital timelines, DNA review, surveillance enhancement, tiny details processed over months instead of days. And according to public statements tied to the case, investigators continue treating the disappearance as active and ongoing, which means the story may still change again. The desert bone was not the ending people feared, but it was a reminder of how quickly hope and fear can collide in investigations like this. One moment people believed the search was over. Hours later, they were back where they started. Still waiting, still searching, still asking the same question. Where is Nancy Guthrie? More than 100 days after Nancy Guthrie disappeared, the investigation remains suspended between two realities. Publicly, there are still unanswered questions. Privately, investigators may believe the answers already exist somewhere inside the evidence. That difference is important, because modern cases are rarely solved the way people expect. Not through one dramatic moment, not through a sudden confession on camera. More often, cases are solved slowly. A digital record finally matches a timeline. A forensic result returns months later. A witness remembers one detail differently after enough time passes. And sometimes the breakthrough comes from pressure building quietly behind the scenes until one piece finally gives way. The Nancy Guthrie case appears to be living inside that kind of pressure now. A disconnected camera, a missing 41-minute window, recovered surveillance images, a hair sample under advanced forensic review, a backpack, a vehicle, a timeline investigators continue examining months later. Individually, none of those details fully explain what happened. Together, they form something investigators may still believe can eventually lead to an answer. But this case also leaves behind another message that matters just as much. Public attention has power. When people continue sharing information responsibly, discussing verified evidence carefully, and keeping focus on the victim instead of speculation, investigations stay visible. Tips continue coming in. Resources continue being justified. Silence becomes harder for a case to disappear into. But responsible attention also requires restraint. Not every rumor is evidence. Not every theory deserves certainty. And not every person discussed online deserves suspicion without proof. That balance may be one of the hardest parts of modern true crime culture. The internet wants immediate conclusions. Real investigations usually move slower than that. Nancy Guthrie was 84 years old. She disappeared from her own home. Her family is still waiting for answers. And despite months of investigation, one central fact remains unchanged. Someone likely knows more than they have said publicly. Maybe it is a detail they dismissed. Maybe it is a behavior they noticed too late. Or maybe it is someone who has stayed silent because they never believed investigators would eventually connect the evidence. But investigations built on forensic timelines often become stronger with time, not weaker. And if that is true here, then the story of Nancy Guthrie may still be unfinished. If you have followed this case, focus on verified information. Share responsibly. And if someone in your life changed after February 1st in a way you still cannot explain, investigators continue asking the public to come forward. Because after 100 days, the biggest question may no longer be whether evidence exists. It may be whether the right person finally decides to speak. The hardest part about investigations like this is that eventually the headlines slow down. The cameras leave. National coverage fades. Online attention moves somewhere else. But for families, none of that changes the reality waiting at home every morning. And that may be the final thing worth remembering about the Nancy Guthrie case. To the public, this story became a mystery built around surveillance images, forensic evidence, and unanswered questions. To the people who knew Nancy, it became an empty chair, a missing phone call, and a routine that suddenly stopped. That difference matters. Because true crime coverage can sometimes reduce people into puzzles instead of human beings. Evidence starts replacing empathy. Theories become louder than fact. Viewers begin chasing conclusions faster than investigators can responsibly confirm them. But this case has repeatedly shown why patience matters. Some of the most important evidence reportedly connected to the investigation was not understood immediately. Surveillance material had to be recovered. Digital timelines had to be reconstructed. Physical evidence required advanced testing. Investigators reportedly continued processing information months after the disappearance itself. That is not unusual in complex modern investigation. It is often the reality, especially in cases involving digital devices, forensic genealogy, and fragmented timelines built around only a few minutes of movement. And perhaps that is why the 41-minute window continues to matter so much. Because inside that silence, investigators appear to believe there is still a story the evidence can tell. Not speculation, not online certainty, evidence. The Nancy Guthrie case may eventually become a story about forensic science, digital recovery, or a behavioral mistake someone failed to hide. Or it may become a story about a witness who finally recognized the importance of something they almost ignored. Right now, nobody outside the investigation can say for certain. But what can be said is this: the case is not forgotten. The search has not fully stopped. And after more than 100 days, investigators still appear to believe the answers are reachable. Maybe slowly, maybe quietly, but reachable. And until those answers arrive, Nancy Guthrie remains more than a headline, more than a mystery, and more than another viral case discussed online. She remains a missing person whose family still deserves the truth.